The day my son's friend visited our house was one of the craziest and most exciting days of my life. It all started on a normal Saturday afternoon. The sun was low over the horizon, casting a warm golden glow through the windows of my living room. I was leaning against the kitchen counter sipping a glass of water as the soft hum of the evening news played in the background. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. My son Daniel was away on a camping trip with his college friends. I was feeling unusually quiet. Then the doorbell rang. I was not expecting anyone to put down their glass of water. I walked to the door and opened it to find Sebastian, Daniel's best friend, standing in front of me. Daniel's best friend, standing there with a flicker of hesitation in his dark eyes, his posture almost apologetic as he greeted me. "Hey, Mr. Johnson," he said with a sheepish smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." Daniel had told me to stop by if I needed anything for the trip, but I hadn't realized he'd already left. Sebastian had been Daniel's friend for years. I'd watched him grow from an awkward teenager into a confident, athletic young man. There was always something about Sebastian, a quiet maturity that stood out in the way he carried himself, a warmth in his smile that put people at ease. He was always polite, thoughtful, the kind of friend any parent would want for their child. "It's no trouble," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "What do you need?" "Actually, I left my sleeping bag at home. I thought Daniel might have a spare one." I chuckled, shaking my head. "He probably does. Let me check the garage." I gestured for him to follow me, and as we made our way to the garage I couldn't help but notice how much he had changed since the last time I'd seen him. He was taller now. He was broader. His shirt clung to his frame in a way that made it clear he'd been hitting the gym regularly. I felt a strange pang of awareness, one that I immediately pushed away. In the garage I rummaged through a pile of camping gear until I found the spare sleeping bag. I handed it to him and brushed off the dust. "There you go," I said. "Daniel won't mind." "Thank you, Mr. Johnson." His smile was genuine. He hesitated for a moment before adding, "Do you mind if I hang out for a bit? My ride doesn't come for an hour, and I don't want to just sit in the car." "Of course," I said. "Come on, come in." We ended up in the kitchen where I was brewing a pot of coffee. Sebastian leaned against the counter, his arms crossed over his chest, leaning against the counter. He had always been easy to talk to, thoughtful and articulate in a way that made conversations with him feel natural, but as the minutes passed I began to notice something different, the way his gaze lingered a second longer than necessary when our eyes met, the way he moved closer as he leaned against the counter, his presence filling the space between us. I tried to ignore it, to chalk it up to my imagination, but when he reached for his cup, his fingers brushed against mine and the warmth of his touch sent a jolt through me. "Sorry," he said, pulling his hand back quickly. "It's okay," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm just clumsy." But the tension in the room was palpable now, the air between us thick with something unspoken. I busied myself with the coffee, trying to shake the strange feeling that had settled in my chest. This was Sebastian, my best friend, whatever I thought. This was Sebastian, my son's best friend. Whatever I thought I was feeling, it wasn't real. "It couldn't be Mr. Johnson," he said after a long pause, his voice softer now. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," I said, turning to face him. He hesitated, his eyes dropping to the floor before meeting mine. "Have you ever felt like you wanted something you knew you shouldn't?" The question caught me off guard and I felt my pulse quicken. "That's a pretty heavy question," I said, trying to keep my tone light. He gave a small, self-aware laugh, running a hand over his head. There was something in his tone, an honesty, a vulnerability that made my chest tighten. I wanted to ask him what he meant, to understand what was going on in his mind, but I wasn't sure I was ready to hear the answer. "Sometimes we want things that aren't good for us," I said. Cautiously, "It's human nature, but that doesn't mean we have to act on it." He nodded, his gaze distant. "Yes, I guess you're right," but the way he looked at me after he said it, the flicker of something in his eyes, the way his lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say more, it left me unsettled. I turned back to the coffee pot, hoping the act of pouring us both another cup would give me something to focus on. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, and I wasn't sure if it was something I could ignore. The coffee sat on contact between us as the conversation grew sparse. I could feel Sebastian's presence like a heavy weight, and every subtle movement he made seemed magnified in the silence. Sebastian leaned back in his chair and stretched slightly, and I caught myself looking at him out of the corner of my eye. His shirt lifted just enough to reveal a strip of taut tan skin, and I immediately looked away. My face warmed. "This is ridiculous," I thought. "Pull yourself together." So I said, breaking the silence, Are you excited about the camping trip?" He shrugged his shoulders and curled his lips into a small smile. Yeah, I guess I mean it's more for Daniel, really. He loves this kind of stuff. I'm just there for the company. His words made me smile. That sounds like you, I said, always looking out for him. You've been a good friend to Daniel over the years. Sebastian looked down, his fingers toyed with the rim of his mug. He's been a good friend to me too, he said quietly. Then after a pause he added, you've been good to me too. There it was again, that softness in his tone, the unspoken layers behind his words. My chest tightened as I searched his face for some clue as to what he was trying to say, but he didn't meet my gaze. I just mean, you've always made me feel welcome, like part of the family. That's not something I take for granted. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. Well, you are part of the family, Sebastian, at least that's how I see it. He smiled at that, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Thank you, Mr. Johnson, he said. Then almost as an afterthought he added, you can call me Sebastian. You know, the Mr. Johnson thing is too formal. I chuckled. All right, Sebastian, but only if you stop calling me Mr. Johnson. Deal, he said, his grin widening just enough to ease some of the tension in the room. We then moved into the living room and sat down on the couch. The sun had set and the soft glow of the table lamp cast warm shadows across the room. Sebastian sat at the far end of the couch, his posture relaxed but his eyes focused on me. Can I ask you something? He said after a long silence. Of course. I could call him Sebastian. Of course, I replied, bracing myself for another loaded question. Have you ever felt like there was something you couldn't say out loud even though you really wanted to? I frowned, caught off guard by the question. I think everyone feels that way at some point, I said carefully, but sometimes saying it out loud is the only way to move forward. Sebastian nodded. His gaze was fixed on the floor. Yes, he said quietly, but what if saying it changes everything? His words sent a shiver down my spine, though I couldn't say why. I shifted in my seat, suddenly aware of how close we were, even with the space between us. Sometimes change is a good thing, I said, trying to keep my tone steady, even if it was scary at first. He looked up, then his eyes locked with mine. What? If not, the weight of his gaze was almost too much and I found myself looking away, unsure of how to handle the sudden shift in our conversation. I guess it depends on what you're afraid of. Sebastian didn't respond right away when he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm afraid of ruining this, of ruining what we have. The vulnerability in his voice caught me off guard. I should probably go. My rides are probably close by now. I stood up too instinctively, reaching out to stop him. My hand wrapped around his arm and he froze, his eyes wide as he looked down at where we touched. You don't have to go, I said softly. Not if you don't want to, Sebastian. Sebastian's eyes lifted to meet mine and for a moment neither of us moved. The air between us felt heavy, electric, like the moment before a storm. Then he took a step closer, closing the distance between us. I don't know what I'm doing, I just know I don't want to leave. His words hit me like a punch in the gut and I felt a surge of emotions. I couldn't name it: fear, confusion, longing. They all swirled together and left me breathless. Sebastian, I said, my voice barely audible. We can't. I know, he whispered, but I can't help it. He reached out, then his hand brushed against mine and I felt a spark, an undeniable pull that left me frozen in place. I wanted to step back, to put some distance between us, but I couldn't. Instead I found myself leaning into the moment, my heart pounding. I leaned into the moment, my heart pounding in my chest, and then it happened. His lips brushed against mine, softly, tentatively, as if testing the waters, my mind screaming at me to pull away, but my body betrayed me. Frozen in place as the kiss deepened, the kiss lingered in the air between us, leaving a weight I didn't know how to bear. Sebastian's breath was shallow, his hand hovered near mine as if he didn't know whether to pull away or come closer. I started, but the words caught in my throat. He pulled away abruptly, running a hand through his hair. I'm so sorry, he blurted out, his voice shaky. I didn't mean to. I don't know what I was thinking. My chest tightened, my heart pounding against my ribs as I searched for something to say. Sebastian, it's okay, I managed, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. Nothing about it felt okay. And yet I couldn't deny the way my body had reacted, the way I had leaned into the kiss. No, it's not okay. I shouldn't have. God, Daniel would kill me if he knew. At the mention of my son, a cold wave of reality washed over me. This was wrong, so wrong, and yet the tension between us remained undeniable and unrelenting. Sebastian, I said gently. I tried to calm my voice. We need to talk about this. He stopped pacing, his shoulders tense as he turned to face me. What is there to talk about? I crossed a line. I screwed up. I'm sorry. I took a step closer, my hands trembling at my sides. It's not just you, I admitted, the words tasting strange in my mouth. I felt it too. His eyes widened. His eyes widened, and for a moment the air between us crackled with something unspoken. Then he shook his head, his expression conflicted. "We can't," he said firmly. "You're Daniel's dad, I'm his best friend. This, whatever this is, it's not supposed to happen." "I know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "but it's done it already." The silence that followed was suffocating. Sebastian sat down on the couch, burying his face in his hands. I wanted to say something, anything that might make this easier, but the truth was I didn't know how to handle this either. After what felt like an eternity he looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and longing. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we'll have to figure it out." He nodded, his eyes dropping to the floor. "I don't want to lose this," he said quietly, "not just, whatever this is, but you, your friendship, your trust. I don't want to ruin it and everything." His words hit me hard and I felt a pang of guilt for putting him in this position. Sebastian had always been like family, someone I could rely on and trust, and yet here we were standing on the brink of something that could destroy all of that. "You're not going to lose me," I said, putting a hand on his shoulder. "On his shoulder, no matter what happens, we'll figure this out." He leaned into my touch, his body relaxing slightly under my hand. "You mean that?" he asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. "I mean it," I said firmly, "but we have to be careful. This isn't just about us, it's about Daniel too." At the mention of my son, Sebastian nodded. His expression somber. "You're right," he said, "we can't let him find out, it would destroy him." The weight of that truth settled over us, a reminder of how precarious our situation was, but even as we sat there, wrapped in silence, I couldn't ignore the way my hand lingered on his shoulder or the way his body seemed to lean against mine. We talked in circles, trying to make sense of what had happened and what it meant, but no matter how hard we tried to rationalize it, the attraction between us remained undeniable and unrelenting. We talked for hours, sometimes touching, but neither of us wanted to, but still there was a certain tension between us all night long, a tension that told me there was more to come, that I wanted more, and so did he. I could feel it as the clock ticked past midnight. "Should go," he said, his voice heavy with reluctance. I also stood and followed him to the door. "Take care of yourself," I said, my chest tightening as he reached for the handle. He paused and turned to look at me one last time. "You too," he said, his eyes searching mine, "and thank you for not hating me." I managed a small smile. "There's nothing to hate, Sebastian, just be careful, okay?" He nodded, his eyes lingering on mine for a moment before he stepped out into the night. As the door closed behind him I leaned against it, my mind racing with everything that had happened and everything that could happen, because deep down I knew for a fact that this wasn't over yet. The way he looked into my eyes, the way we kissed, the way we touched told me that I was not finished with him. He had brought out something in me that I had never felt before, such a young and handsome guy. I am sure every gay man would want to do certain things with him, and I felt that he was open to it. The days after Sebastian's visit were a blur of emotions I couldn't untangle. I went through the motions, work errands, the occasional phone call from Daniel, but my thoughts were consumed by that night, by him, Sebastian. I told myself it would pass. That this was just a fleeting moment of weakness, but every time I closed my eyes I saw his face, heard his voice, felt the warmth of his hand against mine. The weight of it all was suffocating, and yet I couldn't bring myself to let go. I wasn't expecting anyone, and Daniel was still out of town. My heart leapt at the sound, a mixture of fear and hope rushing through me as I opened the door. There he was. "Sebastian, I shouldn't be here," he said before I could say anything, his hand shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. "I know I shouldn't, but I can't stay away." I couldn't stay away. The sight of him standing there, his expression a mixture of vulnerability and determination, left me speechless. I stepped aside, wordlessly inviting him in. He hesitated for a moment before crossing the threshold, his presence filling the room in a way that felt both familiar and strange. "I can't stop thinking about you, I can't stop thinking about you." His words hit me like a punch to the chest and I felt the air leave my lungs. "Sebastian, we talked about this, it's complicated, I know," he said quickly, his voice shaking. "I know it's complicated and I know it's complicated. I know it's complicated and I know it's wrong, but that doesn't change the way I feel. I don't know how to make it stop." I wanted to tell him that he wasn't alone, that I felt the same way, but the words wouldn't come. Instead I reached out my hand and brushed against his arm. He flinched at the touch, but he didn't move away. "Sebastian," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper, "we can't go on like this." "I know," he repeated, his eyes finally lifting to meet mine, "but it's not that easy, is it?" "If it were, I wouldn't be here." His honesty left me raw. stripped of any defenses I might have tried to put up. "What do you want me to say?" "I don't know," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I just don't want to lose you." "You won't," I said firmly, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself, "but this, whatever this is, it can't go on." His shoulders slumped and I saw the weight of my words settle over him. "I don't know if I can stop feeling like this." "I don't know if I can stop feeling like this," he said quietly. "I can't either," but I didn't say it. We ended up back in the living room, sitting on opposite ends of the couch like the last time, the space between us feeling like a chasm, impossible to bridge without falling into the same mistakes. "I've known you for so long," Sebastian said suddenly, breaking the silence. "You've always been this constant in my life, someone I could trust, someone who cared, and somewhere along the way that turned into this." I swallowed hard, my chest tightening at his words. "I care about you too, Sebastian, but this is dangerous, it could ruin everything." "I know, I don't want to ruin anything, but I don't want to pretend that this doesn't exist either." The room was unbearably quiet, the weight of our unspoken feelings pressing down on us. I wanted to say something, to find the right words to make this easier, but nothing came out. "I shouldn't. I can't stay here, not if it means feeling like this and not being able to do anything about it." I stood too, my heart racing as he turned to leave. "Wait," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He froze at the doorknob. "I don't want you to go," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I don't know what to do about this either, but I don't want you to go." He turned slowly, his eyes wide with surprise. "You mean that?" I nodded, my throat tightly. "Yes, I do." The attention in the room shifted, the air between us crackling with unspoken possibilities. He took a hesitant step towards me, his eyes searching mine for permission, for reassurance. "I don't want to make things harder," he said softly, "but being here, being with you, it's bad." Even though I know it shouldn't be. My resolve crumbled at his words, and before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us. "We're playing with fire," I said, my voice barely audible. "Maybe," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips, "but it doesn't feel wrong, not to me." The hours that followed were a blur of whispers, confessions and stolen moments. We didn't cross any lines, not really, not yet, but the connection between us deepened, growing into something that felt impossible to ignore. As dawn cast a soft light over the living room, we sat together on the couch, his head resting on my shoulder, neither of us speaking. But the silence felt comfortable, like a truce. I knew it wasn't sustainable, that we couldn't keep walking this line without it breaking, but for now, in this moment, I let myself lean into it, knowing that the real world would come crashing in soon enough. After a long moment of silence, Sebastian said, "Mr. Johnson, I'm going to be honest with you. I really like you and I don't want to hide it anymore. I'm not sure how you feel about this, but I really need to get this off my chest." And at that moment the tension changed immediately. I felt a moment of excitement go through me. Sebastian had put himself in such a vulnerable position and had confessed his feelings that I said, "Sebastian, I'm so glad you're finally telling me this now. I've been feeling the same way, and you're very attractive to me. You're such a smart, handsome, and good-looking young man that it really turns me on." He grabbed me and kissed me, this time much deeper, more sensitive, and I felt this was a relief for both of us. The kiss deepened, and after a minute of heavy kissing he grabbed me in places I'd love to be touched by him. I let it all happen. The age difference didn't matter. It didn't matter, it was pure love. And now that his shirt was on the floor I could finally enjoy his muscular torso. At one point he stopped kissing me and went down. He did the thing, and although I won't go into detail, I can tell you it was amazing. His lips were so masculine yet so soft it drove me crazy. It went from bad to worse. And we did everything you can imagine. After we both finished we lay there in each other's arms. It wasn't long before Sebastian fell asleep. He must have been exhausted. A moment later I fell asleep too. A few hours later, as the sun rose higher casting long shadows across the living room as the weight of what we had shared settled down above us, Sebastian shifted slightly, his head still resting on my shoulder. For a moment, I allowed myself to bask in the warmth of his presence, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way his hand lightly brushed over mine. It was quiet, but the silence wasn't empty, it was heavy with the implications of what we had done. He lifted his head and rubbed his eyes. "I should go," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion. "Before Daniel returns." I nodded, knowing he was right but feeling the pain of the impending distance between us. "Yes, that's probably best." He stood and stretched, the light catching his face in a way that made my chest tighten. There was a vulnerability in his expression, a mixture of guilt and longing that mirrored my own. He hesitated, as if about to say something, but instead just gave me a small sad smile. "Thank you," he said quietly, for not pushing me away. I stood too, running a hand through my hair, trying to find the right words. Sebastian, this is complicated, I don't know what to do. I don't know where we go from here, but I do know that I don't want to lose you. I care about you more than I probably should, but this can't be something we ignore, not anymore. He nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I know, I feel the same way. The air between us was charged, every unsaid word hanging in the room. Finally he walked towards the door. I'll call you, he said, glancing back at me. Okay, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Take care of yourself, you too, he replied before slipping out into the morning light. The days that followed were excruciating. Sebastian's absence was palpable. His absence left a void I hadn't anticipated. Daniel returned home, oblivious to the tension. I did my best to act normal, to bury the emotions that threatened to bubble over every time I thought of Sebastian, but it wasn't easy. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leapt, hoping it was him, but he didn't call, and the silence between us grew heavier. With each passing day, a week later, Sebastian showed up at my door again. This time there was no pretense, no excuses. He stood on the porch, his hand in his pocket, his eyes meeting mine with a determination that took my breath away. I couldn't stay away, he said, his voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. I tried, but I couldn't. I stepped aside, letting him in without a word. We stood in the hallway, the weight of our unspoken feelings pressing down on us. I thought about everything he said to me, about you, about us, about Daniel, and I know it's messy and complicated, but I also know I can't pretend I don't feel this way. Like I don't feel this way, not anymore. His words broke something open inside me and I felt a rush of emotions I couldn't contain. Sebastian, I started to, but he cut me off. I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I just needed to tell you, to be honest with you. I don't want to hide this anymore, even if it means walking away. The thought of him walking away was unbearable. The thought of him walking away was unbearable, and before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us. My hands found his face and I pulled him into a kiss that was both desperate and tender. He responded immediately, his arms wrapped around me as if he was afraid I would disappear. We broke apart, both of us breathing heavily, our foreheads pressed together. I don't know where this is going, I admitted, my voice shaking, but I don't want to lose you. You won't, he said, his voice firm. We'll figure it out together. And the months that followed were a delicate balancing act, Sebastian and I navigating our emotions carefully, keeping our connection hidden from Daniel and the rest of the world. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, of fear, of questioning if we were doing the right thing, but through it all we clung to each other, finding comfort in the bond we had forged. We knew it couldn't last forever, that the truth would eventually come out, but for now we allowed ourselves to exist in the in-between, savoring the stolen moments and quiet confessions. Stolen moments and quiet confessions that made up our new reality. And as I looked at Sebastian, his smile lighting up the room, I knew one thing for sure: whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, because some connections are too powerful to ignore, too deep to deny, and this, whatever it was worth fighting for.